Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Madam Leader. House Bill 1674 helps protect those that are caught up in a riot that are, let's say, innocently driving through, that are attacked. It gives them criminal and civil liability protection if somebody is injured unintentionally in their efforts to escape from the situation. Yield for questions and move for advancement at the appropriate time.
That concludes the explanation of House Bill 1674. Will there be questions on House Bill 1674? Senator Brooks, you're recognized for a question on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so, I'm sorry I just stepped off onto the floor, but so what is this bill? What is the intention of what it's trying to prevent or resolve?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. House Bill 1674 is a result of some incidents that happened in Oklahoma City and Tulsa. I have a DA's report here from the one in Tulsa, where some innocent folks, one of them, the one in Tulsa, was in a truck pulling an empty horse trailer and was attacked by a rioting mob. They threw full bottles of stuff at their windows, and these pictures here I can share with you, and I apologize for not sharing this with the committee. I didn't have it at the time. They tried to get them out of the truck. The kids were so scared they had to huddle in the bottom of the truck. They did injure somebody as they escaped the situation. The DA decided not to prosecute, and we don't want this to happen again where somebody fears prosecution because they felt imminent harm and wanted to get out of the situation.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And if the author could put the mic closer to his mouth, I'm having trouble hearing you, so I appreciate it. And so, as I understand it, there was an event that happened in Tulsa. A car was surrounded, and the person was able to drive off, and no charges were filed. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
So in the case that you cite, the prosecutor was able to exercise discretion. In his discretion, he decided not to file charges. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. That is correct. However, I would add that as this body, we can make sure that the next prosecutor doesn't feel compelled by some other motive to file charges, as we've seen in other states when somebody is innocently escaping from a situation.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so the way that the system is currently set up, the system worked, did it not?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Actually, I think that I'm not sure. I have not talked to the individual himself, but my understanding was he was reluctant to try to get out of the situation, and only because he did. And again, somebody was harmed in the process. I think citizens should feel fine that if their life is threatened, they should be able to escape the situation.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. But reluctance, when you're considering running through a crowd of people, is probably not a bad thing, is it?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. We talked about this in committee. This only covers unintentional harm, not intentional harm, and only when you're facing imminent harm yourself.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
I understand, but if we're going to create a law based on one occurrence, in the occurrence, the prosecutor made the right decision, and the person was reluctant initially, but after that was able to drive away from the situation, I don't understand why we need to create a new statute to be able to address this issue.
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Well, we've had more than one issue in Oklahoma. I don't have the details from the Oklahoma issue, but the gentleman in Oklahoma City was successfully pulled from his vehicle and beaten. So we have a couple examples where this bill would protect that victim.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so you're aware of other issues? Could you give me any details about those issues?
Mr. President, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that question.
Senator Brooks, can you repeat your question?
Yes, Mr. President. And so you mentioned that you're in addition to this one event that occurred in Tulsa, that you're aware of other events. Could you give me a couple other examples where this has come up?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. You and I both know, Senator, that around the country we've seen massive riots over the last 6 to 12 months. Some innocent citizens caught up in those riots, and we don't want the same thing happening here in Oklahoma where somebody is not able to get out when they are in imminent harm to themselves and their family. I think you and I both would agree on that.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, but you can't give me any other examples of anything that happened in Oklahoma. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yeah, we do have the example in Oklahoma City that I cited, but I do not know the details. I saw it on a news report.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, if you're going to run a bill, wouldn't it be worthwhile if it's an issue that you're trying to address that you might have some detail?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Senator, I'd be glad to share. There's actually 4 or 5 pages of photos on this incident in Tulsa, which is very disturbing. I think if this is going to happen within these riots, these people ought to have the freedom and the comfort in knowing that they can get out of those situations.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. President. And so you mentioned that there are national examples of this. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I did not give specific national examples, only the nature of the riots over the last 6 to 12 months around the country.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
At this point, I understand that I've asked a few questions, and so I'm happy to yield to my colleague from Tulsa.
Senator Matthews, you're recognized for a question on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, would you tell me the meaning of a riot? Mr. President, could you give me the meaning of a riot?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I apologize. Of the rioter or the riot? I didn't catch that, Senator.
Senator Matthews, you're recognized to clarify your question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would you give me the meaning of the word R-I-O-T? Riot.
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I just didn't want to apologize for clarifying. I just didn't want to hear the wrong thing. I think riot is defined in statute. I don't see that it's defined in this particular bill. So I see that it is addressed in this bill, but I don't see it defined. I assume it is defined elsewhere in statute, but I don't see it defined here.
Senator Matthews for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would you believe, Senator, that in my experience on the fire department, where we have specific procedures that have to do with riots, where fires and things are being burned down and people are tearing up property and things that happened in my own community in 1921. So as it relates to this bill, I'm just wondering, what riot in Tulsa are you talking about? I don't remember a riot in Tulsa since 1921.
Oh, thank you for the question, Mr. President. I don't know the definition, and to delve into that may be too deep for this particular bill, but I do have photos of this particular incident, and I think a lot of you, Senator, I would think you would agree with me that this is an unsafe situation for this family of 4.
Senator Matthews for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would agree that this is unsafe. When someone got knocked off a bridge and crippled, that was unsafe for that individual. But when we're passing legislation, and words do matter, and this word says penalties for rioting. And on page 1, line 22, any murder, maiming, robbery, rape, or arson in the course of such riot, because I've gone through the last 6 years learning about the difference in a riot and a murder or a massacre. And so if we're going to pass legislation with this word riot in it, because there is a difference, and I do believe that if there is an actual riot, we do have to be safe. And so as we look at this, I think I would like to clarify before anybody votes on this bill what you mean by riot.
Hey, thank you for, Senator, Mr. President, for your very timely question. My colleagues, thank you so much for helping me. Under state statute, the definition is any use of force or violence or any threat to use force or violence accompanied by immediate power of execution by 3 or more persons acting together and without authority of law is riot.
Senator Matthews for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So when you name Tulsa specifically, can you tell me what act of force was happening in the incident that you're talking about, where an act of force, as you say, means riot? What act of force was happening and who was it upon?
I can read a couple of the comments here, Senator, Mr. President. Impact a projectile on the front windshield of family truck. Throwing a projectile at family truck. Attempts by protesters to break into family horse trailer. Family truck and horse trailer under attack. Family truck and horse trailer under attack. Protester hurling flaming projectile smoke canister towards family horse trailer. Horse trailer ramp pulled down and protester riding on ramp as family truck and horse trailer tried to escape. I mean, if you look at the pictures, they're trying to rip off the external rearview mirror. They're trying to rip open the door. And there's many, many of them here. They're throwing actually looks to be like a barbecue grill at them. So yes, I would define this according to the definition I just read.
Senator Matthews for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since you're so aware of what happened in Tulsa, Senator, did this happen before or after someone was knocked off the bridge and the person started to leave without care for the individual, or was it just that they just started doing this to an individual? Are you clear on that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. My understanding from this story, not to conflate with any others, is this was a family trying to drive down a normal street that was not warned that they couldn't get through, and they ran into a crowd of protesters that then turned into a riot.
Senator Matthews for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would you believe that my understanding of the story is that there were people protesting in the way, and the individual ran into and knocked someone off the bridge, and they tried to stop the individual, and he didn't stop, and those things started to happen to try to stop him. The police didn't stop him, and nobody stopped him. Were you aware that a lot of the things that happened were people trying to stop an individual that had hit someone?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I applaud that. I mean, I think there's always good people everywhere, Senator, and so I have no doubt that there are people trying to stop attacks and stuff, but the reality of the situations we've seen that this bill came from are not that.
Members, I want to take this opportunity to remind us all as we move through the next 2 weeks, or the remainder of this week and the next week. There's a lot of passion that goes on, and I want to remind you of Rule 5.5C. 5.5C says, on the floor during session in committee, members should endeavor to be congenial and complimentary. Members should avoid personal attacks and dealing in personalities. During public occasions away from the Capitol, members should endeavor to keep personalities out of their discussions and deal with programs, not personalities. Just ask that you keep that in mind as we move forward. And I would also ask that you please address your questions through the chair. Further questions on House Bill 1674? Senator Brooks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so getting back to the questions I was asking earlier, so the purpose of this bill is to provide criminal and civil immunity. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes, for those that are in this situation.
You're recognized for a follow-up, Senator Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. President. And at this point, you're unable to cite an example in the state of Oklahoma in which someone was criminally charged or civilly sued as a result of the circumstances that you lay out. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. President. At this time, I don't have somebody that's criminally prosecuted, but I have a...
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so during the previous committee meeting, I was able to bring up an example where someone was criminally charged in Charlottesville for an incident that occurred on August 12, 2017. Do you remember that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so in that case, an individual, James Alex Fields, Jr., who had previously espoused neo-Nazi and white supremacist beliefs, his car was surrounded by counter-protesters. He hit the gas, injured 9, and killed 1 person. Are you familiar with that?
Mr. President, just from the words you've told me.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So since the committee meeting, you haven't had a chance to be able to do any research on that case?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. I don't feel like that question or that incident falls into this bill.
Senator Brooks for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so applying the provisions of your bill to this situation in which Mr. Fields ran down 9 people and killed 1, this would have provided him a claim to civil and criminal immunity. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. He's not in Oklahoma, and I do not believe that's accurate.
Further questions on House Bill 1674? Senator Kurt, you're recognized for a question on 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. On page 3, line 6, it specifically references rendering a road unreasonably inconvenient. What is the definition of inconvenient that is allowable for hitting or murdering someone?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Unreasonably is a high standard.
Senator Kurt for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And what about the use of the word inconvenient? Inconvenient implies that something is minimally a problem. How can you define inconvenient in terms of this level of response from a driver?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I think the words go together, unreasonably inconvenient. Unreasonable is a high standard.
Sir Weaver, you're recognized for a question on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, do you believe, Mr. President, that you have a liberty in the United States for free movement?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes.
Senator Weaver for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, internationally, since the 1940s, that was established, and also, Mr. President, in Article 4, our Constitution would argue that would you not agree to that?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I would agree with that.
Senator Weaver for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Under the Fourth Amendment, we have the search and seizure laws for the Oklahoma and for the United States. Would you not agree, Mr. President?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I agree with that.
Senator Weaver for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And under that Fourth Amendment, whenever you have in your house and in your effects, you have certain rights. And in your house, Mr. President, you have to have a search warrant or extreme probable cause to enter that house because you have a standing. And with a vehicle, Mr. President, you lose some of those rights, but would you not agree that you still have a right of presence in your vehicle as a citizen?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Absolutely.
Senator Weaver for a follow-up.
I think this is my last question. So if you combine those, this bill to me is about a family or an individual's right to free movement down the street and their ability, they've got some type of right based on the Fourth Amendment in that vehicle. So would you not agree that they should, Mr. President, this is not about, to me, about rights. It's about freedom of movement for people and the citizens of our state to go from point A to point B without having someone approach their vehicle, not allow them to go down the street. Have I missed something, Mr. President?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. No, I agree completely. I think this bill is about the safety and freedom of citizens that drive down the streets of Tulsa, Oklahoma City, or the city in Oklahoma.
Minority Leader Floyd, you're recognized for a question on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I appreciate the comments that I'm hearing and the discussion that's going back and forth. We're trying to weigh out the rights of people to assemble but not riot, and then to protect the people that are inadvertently brought into these situations. I understand we're trying to do a balancing act here, but my concern is with the bill on page 2, line 21 through 24, it talks about every person who shall unlawfully obstruct the normal use of any public street, and this is all new language, every person who shall unlawfully obstruct the normal use of any public street, highway, or road within the state by impeding, hindering, or restraining a motor vehicle, traffic, or passage thereon. But then we get to the line 24, and it says, by standing or approaching a motor vehicle. So under this new language, a person could be charged with rioting for simply standing close to a street if the driver says that it's impeding their right to move their motor vehicle. Isn't that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Hey, Mr. President, you're telling me line 2 or page 2, line 20. Draining. Is that? Would you mind repeating that question? Let me find exactly what you're talking about.
Certainly, page 2, line 21 through 24, which is new language. It's going in as paragraph 5. And if you look at line 24, it says that you could be obstructing the normal use of a public street by standing.
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes, I think this is not for prosecution. This is for obstructing, unlawfully obstructing the normal use of any public street, highway, or road.
Senator Floyd for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. There were some riots in my district over the last year and a half. There's been a lot of assemblies in my district over the last year and a half. So how do we qualify standing as a riotous event or standing as just being assembled to listen or observe?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Now reading this paragraph again, at the beginning of the paragraph, I think spells it out. So any person that shall unlawfully obstruct the normal use, that is one way they could unlawfully, but it has to be unlawfully. Obviously, if they're protesting and assembling under the law, then that doesn't qualify.
Senator Floyd for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. What's the definition? How do you unlawfully stand somewhere?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I believe if you're standing in the middle of a roadway without any type of permission or something, I believe that's jaywalking. That's unlawfully. I think you need to be abiding by the law, which means that pedestrians probably shouldn't be standing in the middle of a highway.
Senator Floyd for a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. President. But under the definition of rioting in Section 1311 of Title 21, it says it be 3 or more people acting together and without authority. So 2 people standing wouldn't be a violation, but 3 people would.
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Under the riot, I think probably, according to the definition I read a minute ago, it does say 3 or more.
Further questions on House Bill 1674? Senator Hicks, you're recognized for a question on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. So just for clarification, if I was taking my 3 small children across a roadway and the time at which to cross that intersection runs out, I'm now unlawfully potentially obstructing traffic by trying to get my small children across the intersection, and the motor vehiclist would have every right to run my family down. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. No.
Further questions on House Bill 1674? Seeing no further questions, Senator Standard asks unanimous consent that the bill be advanced, and without objection, that will be the order. I declare the bill to be advanced. Members, House Bill 1674 is before you on third reading and final passage. Will there be debate? There will be debate. Senator Matthews, you're recognized for debate on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I am purposefully speaking softly because for some reason when I speak with passion, I guess I'm being rude. The author of this bill is a very good friend of mine that I have tremendous amount of respect for, particularly in his past profession and in his body. I never called his name, and I've never blamed him of anything. Yet, I've been rebuked here when someone has called my name personally. Passionate for 20 minutes, that didn't happen. And so, let me clarify. I have never said that people shouldn't be protected in their cars from harm. All of my questioning has been around the word riot. And let me give you some context. In my community, people were bombed from the air. People had cannons shot into our churches. Some accounts, 300 people dead and businesses burned down. And it was said that my people were rioting. when it was not true. So we named it not the 1921 race riot, we changed it to massacre because my people were massacred and killed. And it was called a riot by the newspapers, and so insurance claims were not paid. There is a difference in words. I worked for the fire department for 25 years, and this was one of the incidents that happened. When a riot happens, sometimes it's for firefighters to be safe. They don't do their job normally in a riot. But if it were buildings being burned down from arson and other things, they would go in normally. But in a riot, there is a different protocol. The word riot. The word riot. I spelled it out, R-I-O-T. I never said that people shouldn't be safe. I don't want my family to have people throw rocks at them or any of that. But it's, for some reason, I don't know why, I think I clearly said that. But there's a perception. My good friend, the public safety officer, I agree with him when he was asking questions, that people should feel safe. But words make a difference. And so if we pass this bill and it said that 2 or 3 people impeding someone is a riot, and we pass a riot, and this is a seminal moment in our history. This is the 100th year of the 1921 race, what we call massacre, but race riot. And so it's not cute, and it's not cool that we're trying to address what happened across America in passing every piece of legislation to keep people from protesting when African Americans are killed unarmed. This is a sensitive moment. And Oklahoma is at the forefront of making sure they push back and not addressing the real deal. What about the safety of people that get killed unarmed and people are upset? Would you be upset if people look like you were killed without being armed by people that are armed to protect them? And so that's why protests have happened. And I am concerned about us naming it a riot when it's a protest. We could have said when protests lead to violence. We could have said when people attack a car or any of that. And so my passion is about that in this moment. I am in this body who has supported the work we're doing in Tulsa around this. And I thank you all for that. But know that my passion is not against the author. My passion is not against protecting people. I just want to say that when we pass anti-riot laws like this without considering, we didn't even have a conversation about it. I spoke about it in appropriations, and all of you, many of you that have dealt with me over the last few years know that my concern is how we move forward as a state. And I'm a public safety officer. I want us all to be safe. But in this body, I've seen all of the safety be for the people that are already armed, for police officers. Not one thing. Now, I've seen 1 or 2 pieces of legislation that protect the citizens. And we talked about victims' rights. But we have not been open to the person that was crippled, knocked off that bridge, the persons that have been killed. I have my colleague that I talked to just yesterday, and we're talking about safety. And I appreciate that. But in this piece of legislation, passed as a riot act, I am against it, and I'm against it for that reason. I will be voting no. And I'm not mad, but I am hurt that this is the way that I'm looked at, because I made a point and get rebuked by the chair. I haven't seen that when the people named me and talked 20 minutes about how I act. And so I want to be clear. This is a sensitive word. This is a sensitive issue. And I'm a black man. And that's who's being killed, unarmed. And the people in my community, they are not in this. They can't pass these laws. All they can do is gather and let people know that they're upset. And they call it a protest until we do something about unarmed black men being killed. And so I don't agree. Nobody should attack anybody in a car. Nobody should make people feel threatened. I agree with that. But to name it a riot, that's what happened in 1921, and my people are still reeling from that, having to build their businesses back, having to do that without benefit of insurance that they paid because they named it a riot. And we're naming this bill after a riot, and that's my concern, so I'm voting no.
Senator Brooks, you're recognized for debate on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so the author has been unable to give any specific example of anyone charged or sued in the state of Oklahoma. Instead, the only example this morning that was cited where someone was charged criminally was a hate crime committed in another state by a white supremacist and an espoused, someone who had espoused Nazi beliefs. I am unwilling to become an apologist for such conduct, and I'm urging my colleagues to vote no as well.
Senator Young, you're recognized for debate on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first appreciate the fact that you read that rule a few minutes ago and brought back the idea of decorum. I wish you had been in the chair some time ago when I was at home and watching, and one of our distinguished members used the term BS, and it would have been, I think, appropriate at that time. So let me say thank you for that. First off, this particular legislation turns peaceful protesters into rioters. If there is no corresponding part to this bill that says if I take a car and drive it into rioters, why shouldn't I be just as guilty and face the same type of reproach and recurrence of laws that those who are standing there maybe doing nothing, just being peaceful in protest? They're getting charged more. And listen, I don't want to be painted as someone who is against law enforcement. As many of you said over the years, some of my best friends are law enforcement. So we need to be careful. We just had a bill a few minutes ago. This bill, they're tandem in showing that we have a problem in the state of Oklahoma with allowing folk to voice their opinion. We need to be protecting those individuals who are in disagreement with things that are occurring in our nation. And the people who have called me, who have contacted me over and over again about the last piece of legislation and this legislation, it breaks my heart because they're saying, well, why didn't this come up 2 or 3 years ago? Why is it now? Is it just in response to the protests that are beginning to make an impact into, once again, this idea and thought that maybe we're holding on to something in this state and in this country that we need to bring out in the open and discuss openly? It is larger than just these pieces of legislation. It is something that is a rot in the very essence and core of our being. And until we get that, we're going to continue to take peaceful protesters and term them as rioters. And we use that terminology for a reason and a purpose. Mr. President, I hold that we ought to look at this piece of legislation like we looked at the last one and maybe take a stance right now and say, no, let's don't do that. We already got a legislation that people can be put in jail if they do the very things that's stated in this legislation. There's already, listen, I can get arrested for anything that's already in this legislation now. Why should we create more on top of more just to look like we are trying to bring order when actually what we're doing is trying to maintain a way of being that has outlived its own usefulness? Let's stop. let's stop and pay attention to what we are doing in this body, in this chamber, and start looking at a larger picture that we can make Oklahoma better than just okay.
Minority Leader Floyd. She waves. Further debate on House Bill 1674. Senator Standridge, you recognize closed debate on House Bill 1674.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for my colleagues for their words. Obviously, there's a lot of heart and emotion in those. I would point out just a couple things. I want to get off this bill. I know we got other work to do, but somebody mentioned the riot. It's larger than the riots or the protests themselves. I agree with that. We see protests around the country, which I fully, and I think everybody in this body supports fully, turn into riots. I mean, just this week we had some folks lock people in a public building and try to set it on fire. Those people were innocent. They weren't wanted for anything. And so in Tulsa, we had a similar incident where a family of four, two young children driving through a normal city street are stopped and accosted, and their truck and trailer tried to destroy and tried to be pulled out of a vehicle. The kids cowered in the back seat because they feared for their lives. Yes, this family had to injure somebody on the way out, but they shouldn't have to be worrying about that. They should be worried about getting their kids to safety. That's what this bill is about. It's not about hurting people that are unarmed. And somebody mentioned about waiting for someone to be charged. Why would we wait for somebody that's fearing for their life to be charged by a DEA that wants to make a political case of something? We see this around the country. We don't need it here, so let's just put it on the books so those families are protected. They can get out of the situation, get their families to safety. I encourage your yes vote on this bill.
Members, that concludes debate on House Bill 1674. The vote will now occur. If you favor the measure, you vote aye. If you oppose the measure, you vote nay. Clerk, please open the roll. Are there those wishing to vote or change the vote? Chair spreading close. Close the roll. House Bill 1674 having received 38 aye and 10 nay, I declare the same to have passed.